I gave a rather commercial, bombastic title to my talk, Umwelt's embodied mediatization, but what really I'm talking about is a biosemiotic approach to technology. And I think that during this conference, the topic was approached in a number of ways. You know, those of us who were here during the workshop listened to Elise Bizant's workshop on the matter. Yesterday, Sigmund Ongstad, I think, touched upon the matter. We had a panel on Simondon. Vinicius Romanini and Ludmila Lackova and other colleagues also approached the topic. Specifically, and I was very happy to see all that, specifically, I'm going to discuss how biosemiotics can approach the mind-body problem, which I'll explain in a moment. I think that this is crucial for the academic salience of biosemiotics. Such a discussion will allow seeing technology as that which expands Umwelten, and as such expanding affordances, and technology is an expansion of affordances that results in an increase of semiotic freedom. And for this, I find particularly useful integrating a notion of medium in the biosemiotic framework, and here I mean precisely that notion of medium from media theory. This will then allow for an outlook on Umwelten as media products, and I argue as well that this should come along with a biosemiotic notion of the body. The mind technology problem. Starting primarily with Descartes, modernity left us with the mind-body problem. If mind and body are different ontologies, how can they interact? This is what the modernists were trying to answer. Of course, we are now not concerned with answering the question, but with undermining mind-body dualism altogether. And technology is helping out here. The advent of digital technology recently, particularly its implications for AI, brings new perspectives in this regard. Particularly recently, in a book in 2020 by Klaus Gartner and Hippolito, it has been thoroughly explained that recent technological progress replaces the mind-body question with a mind-technology question. And I find this very useful, citing from the book, as we design, create, and learn to live with a new order of artifacts which exhibit behavior that, were it to be carried by human beings, would be seen as intelligent, the ways in which we conceptualize intelligence, minds, reasoning, and related notions such as self and agency are undergoing profound shifts. And the mind-body problem stems from a mechanistic folk psychology, which is not an assumed mechanistic philosophy. That actually came later. The modernists thought in the terms afforded by their technological environment, mechanical technology. The advent of the computer, by contrast, brings a semiotic problematization of the mind in terms of encoding, information transformation, and computation. Citing again from the same book, with the computer comes cognitive science, as we understand it today, and the idea that brains, and indeed minds, can be understood as encoders and transformers of information. Semiotic interest here. Mind, thinking, and all the processes of cognition are no longer conceived of as something immaterial, but realized by specific mechanisms, especially the mechanisms of information transformation and computation. I think this is great, I agree, but I particularly see the opportunity here for biosemiotics to uproot the mechanistic reductionism view in computation, to which Klaus Gartner and Hippolito apparently still indulge. So, from a contemporary mind technology perspective, the mind is material. Even though digitalization seems to add layers of representation in the construction of Umwelten, digital technology collapses mind-body dualism. It highlights the materiality of the mind. Citing the mind technology problem assumes that mental processes are material. Some problems, such as the problem of mind-body interaction, dissolve. If the mind is material, there is no mind-body problem as such, or at least no problem of interaction. And very early on, in 2002, his book, Understanding Media Semiotics, Marcel Danesi argued so too. He I think he was really avant-garde in anticipating this back then, citing from Danesi, rather than take the mind out of the human body and transfer it to cyber systems or humanoid machines, the whole technology that undergirds the digital galaxy will bring about a reintegration of the body and the mind. This process of re-embodiment is a result of what McLuhan called retribalization. 20 years ago is a very long time for the digital age. Danesi remarked this before social media, before smartphones, and I would say this was really a remarkable foresight, revealed through a media and semiotic interrogation. He refers to McLuhan, he comes up with this notion of digital galaxy in analogy to McLuhan's Gutenberg galaxy. Of course, he throws in here the notion of embodiment, right? He says that digital technology will cause a re-embodiment, and also refers to McLuhan's social phenomenon of retribalization. And I find particularly to bring the concept of medium into biosemiotics, I find particularly relevant the work of Lars Ellerstrom. I believe many of you know, sadly recently passed away. Ellerstrom had a thoroughly cognitive semiotic and media, developed a thoroughly cognitive semiotic and media theory. And he argued that a medium should be understood in a broad way as the intermediate stage of communication. Thus, the term medium here refers not only to mass media, but also media used in more intimate communication. Not only external technological devices, but also media based on corporeality. And the notion of corporeality, I think, is of particular interest for biosemiotics. Not only premeditated media, but also casual media. Not only practical purposes, but also artistic media. So Ellerstrom builds, of course, on McLuhan's notion of medium as extension of the self, but he also adds something new, which in a sense, he is explicit about the fact that contradicts McLuhan in some regard. So he clearly stated, in contrast to McLuhan, I define media products, so not media but media products, as extensions of mind in the context of communication. As being a media product should be understood as a function rather than an essential property, virtually any material entity can be used as one. So by expanding the traditional use of the medium concept across these old dichotomies, technology, body, and so on, mind can be interrogated as mediation. Particularly, the notion of corporeality here is important. Corporeality evokes or establishes mediality, I would argue. And it may seem, of course, Cartesian to define media products of extensions of the mind, but this is not the case because Ellerstrom is building on an embodied notion of the mind. This is quite explicit in his work. And this allows for a more precise notion than McLuhan's medium as extension of the self. And I would like to add a definition to the notion, another definition which I believe is mutual to that of Ellerstrom, and I find insightful. I'm not sure what Ellerstrom would say about this. I would love to still have the opportunity to talk with him about it. I involve the notion of affordance and say that medium is anything that presents affordances to an organism, and I think that this is mutual with Ellerstrom's take. The notion of affordance is a commonplace in semiotics. It comes from Gibson's psychological perception theory. In brief, Gibson explained that animals do not perceive static objects in the environment, but affordances for action. From this point of view, the animal and its environment are mutual and complementary. The notion was recently expanded to discuss the affordance of technological media in a way that supports Ellerstrom's view, I would say. So in some paper from 2014, which pretty much defined the notion, someone whose name I can't pronounce, is it Polish? Maszczyrzak, something like that, with colleagues, define technological media affordance as the mutuality of actor intentions and technology capabilities that provide the potential for a particular action. And from this perspective, we see in authors such as Hopkins, but not only, this is a citation that I find particularly relevant, digital media is a uniquely human technology. Pretty much what Danesi was saying 20 years ago. Perhaps, Hopkins continues, the most human of all technologies that can be considered alongside other abstract human creations such as languages or art. And in a recent paper, I argued that I tried to identify a couple of similarities, a couple of shared affordances between digital media and, let's call them, human-natural environments. I'd say that these seem to share affordances more than other historically previous technological media. Particularly in a semiotic concern, I identify them as multimodality versus the monomodality of print. I think this is something that also Yogi was addressing without a concern for technology specifically. Schematicity or iconicity, and I think this was present in Yogi's presentation away too, and what Danesi called collective participation on the spot, right? Say I get Snapchat texts and I answer back on the spot to this kind of messages, in contrast to how broadcasting works. Now, mediatization, the notion of mediatization easily supports a view of being as becoming, a teleology of the mind, like that of Peirce, for instance. Philosophy of technology naturally relates to media theory. And Fuller also observes, Steve Fuller, might be familiar, observes an important link these two, technology and media philosophy, have with the pragmatic view on evolution. He argues that once in America, Kapp, the father of philosophy of technology, was captivated by Emerson's, the pragmatist who inspired Peirce, Emerson's characterization of the telegraph as an extension of the human senses, an image that McLuhan popularized in the 60s to cover all media. What might be called the strong mind technology thesis is that the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of technology are two ways of talking about the same thing, whereby technology is understood to mean the mind's outworking in nature. I think that thinking of technology as the mind's outworking in nature is very insightful. This view implies understanding subjects not as defined only by their past evolution and present state, but in light of their becoming. Right? I'm thinking Peirce here. Thus, the human is not only everything that evolved from the bipedal ape, as Linnaeus would have it, inclusive as Linnaeus' notion was at the time. The mind technology problem invites a view on the human as the cyborg that it may become, the cyborg that the human can become. And Peirce's pragmatism is an excellent underpinning philosophy for this endeavor. Andrew Stables explained in a book that I like very much from 2012, Semiosis and the Myth of Reason. He explained that semiotics allows for a view on being as becoming. And this was also the main point in Colapietro's very well-known book on the Peircean notion of the self. Thus, from this perspective, the notion of semiotic causation lends itself to such analysis. The biosemiotic position, though, contradicts an important argument in Fuller's transhumanism, namely what's called morphological freedom. Some transhumanists argue that humans should not be ethically obstructed from taking any shape that technology allows them to take. Say, if technology can make me look like a peanut, is the argument in transhumanism, I should be allowed to look like a peanut. Biosemiotics, the biosemiotic position, as I see it, does not see this as a question of ethics. And the question, I think, is controversial, but from a biosemiotic perspective, if you look like a peanut, you are a peanut. And so in this regard, biosemiotics, I guess, goes against Fuller. But there's something very interesting here, because Fuller throws semiotics a very useful stick, saying that we have only that Peirce type of evolution has always been the right thing. We've always been right about evolution, because Peirce's semiotics thinks of evolution in light of final causation, not in the Lamarckian way, not in the Darwinian way. It's a transhumanist view, really, Fuller would argue, and it is anti-vitalist as well. Citing from Fuller, the family of thinkers in the modern era called evolutionists, who differed considerably over the means and ends of such evolution, have nevertheless shared a continuous turn of mind that tends to reduce difference of kind to difference of degrees, hence the anti-vitalism. And then explicitly, I credit this insight to Peirce, and moves on to the medieval debate on universals, realism versus nominalism, and so on, right? And further on, biosemiotics has exploited this view on evolution, of course, as I was mentioning a moment ago, particularly via what Hofmeyr called semiotic causation, right? Based on the Peircean idea that the interpretant is always located in the future. Representamen and object, past and present, are regulated by what they are infinitely semiosically unfolding, right? As Hofmeyr puts it, causation, semiotic causation is causation of bringing about effects through interpretation. And this is what allows biosemiotics to discuss semiosis on multiple time scales. Now, for biosemiotics, the body is important, but we lack a notion of the body, right? And a biosemiotic notion of the body is mutual with a biosemiotic notion of the mind. A biosemiotic notion of mind has not been developed yet, despite Friedrich Sternfeld's observation quite a while ago, citing what is called for is a concept of the body which in itself makes evident the basic semiotic competencies of an organism, a body concept which entails semiotics. It is to be expected, naturally, that this will give rise to a more fine-grained typology of bodies, depending on how complicated and sophisticated semiotic behavior the organism in question can indulge in. And another very important point in thinking through the body in a biosemiotic way is found yet again in Hofmeyr, who argued that the skin, the organ of the skin, is the biological locus of personhood. I know this is controversial. And this implies, to develop such a notion, then this implies trying to see the world from the skin's perspective. And to do so, I argue that we need in biosemiotics to take an account of embodied cognition. And, you know, I think we should take on what was developed in cognitive semantics via Lakoff and Johnson. We heard a brilliant presentation on this by Robert earlier, actually. The notion of embodiment in Varela's and activism works as well, not with the anti-representationism and so on, but the notion of embodiment alone works. And I think that we need one more notion to explain this mediation that the body does through the skin between inner and outer. And I find in this regard very insightful Irene Mittelberg's notion of exbodiment or exbodied cognition, which actually also Ivan, I was really happy to see him mentioning this earlier in the conference. So Mittelberg explains that the body portrays, that is, exbodies, how the person or organism conceptualizes and understands abstracta. This is exbodied cognition. Mittelberg particularly observes it in gesturality. So I think that this allows a finer-grained understanding of, say, what Dilly meant from a biosemiotic perspective, that the Innenwelt founds the Umwelt, but the Umwelt grounds the Innenwelt. Or what Paolucci remarks in a cognitive semiotic perspective, that inference is perceptive, not the other way around, affordances, right? And of course, both these statements are founded on Peirce's notion of perceptual judgment, contradicting the Kantian synthetic a priori, perceptual judgment being basically defined as asserting that in perceiving the world, we assert in propositional form what the character of a percept directly present to the mind is. And from having assumed these concepts in a recent paper in Biosemiotics, I argued that, well, I define the body as that which simultaneously internalizes and externalizes the mind. So instead of discussing mind and body, I propose discussing exbodiment and embodiment as two directions of the same mind. So to answer to Sternfeld's proposal, together with Kerry Campbell and Kalevi-Kuhl, we scrutinize the notion of semiotic competence also in light of semiotic resources and affordances. So we define semiotic competence as the capability of an organism dependent on its embodied morphology, right, anti-morphological freedom, to discover meaning resources in a given environment and to recombine them in new pragmatically functional models. Further, semiotic competencies are then employed to scaffold knowledge, semiotic scaffolding, which is to say to develop models of their environment, which result in a capacity to navigate in the environment. And then Together with this, we think of affordances as potential semiotic resources that an organism enacts to channel learning as choice in the environment. And these notions, of course, can be easily applied, generalized to media affordances generally. How am I doing with time? Thanks. Then I think that at this point, with these notions in mind, we can scrutinize in detail the phenomenon of semiotic scaffolding, which Hofmeier employed also to explain emergence, something very important for philosophy of technology, right? So Hofmeier argued that the invention of social semiotic scaffolding mechanisms such as dance, art, written language, city life, military organizations, cathedrals, movies, TV, cinema, what have you, the internet, most importantly, has gradually offered new generations stronger semiotic scaffolding structures, implying that not only new agendas for creativity are opened, but also deeper meaning contents can be grasped and shared through human history. And here's emergence. Each new jump to higher level semiotic scaffolding systems tends to homogenize cultural performances at the lower level while opening up new agendas of expressivity at the higher level. Thus, compared with the diversity of ways handwritten manuscripts had been designed earlier, manuscripts published as books after the advent of the printing press become much more standardized, right? And from this point of view, the way we extend the mind actually is through semiotic scaffolding, right? Cobley and Sternfeld offer a beautiful example of the sort, which actually Hofmeier refers to. For instance, the book remembers far more and far more accurately than the brain evolved in the book's construction. Having externalized embodied cognition. Having externalized an argument structure in a book chapter, the writer is free to take the results as new starting points, as scaffolds for the next chapter. Embodied cognition. Effectively constructing the book as a long, coherent, argumentative arc, which was never present to the author's mind in its entirety. Signs are indispensable scaffoldings for humans in thought and action. So my argument here is that scaffolding maintains media affordances, right? At first, cinema copied the structure, the style of the novel. Video games copy cinema and so on. We're stuck in the practices of the past. And as we are working out what we can do with the new medium, we are discovering its affordances. We don't understand yet what the internet can do, really. Right? Examples of this are, say, nationalism. Nationalism was afforded by print, as you know, Benedict Anderson, I would say, irrevocably explained, right, that nations could be imagined as communities only because of the medium of print and how the printing press was used in Europe. A more subtle argument is as well, and you know, like we are well over the age of print, and yet we still live in a global world of nations. We are stuck in the habits of the past. Another more subtle example is culturalism, which I think I'll skip, hoping that I have time for one question at least. Thank you so much, but maybe I don't.
Thank you very much, Alin. And once again, we only have time for a very brief question, which Yogi will take. Go ahead, Yogi.
I love the presentation.
Thank you.
And I think that a lot of you're spot on with question about pluralism. If we acknowledge that we all have very different bodies and are like weird, then how does artificial technologies represent or not represent this in their standardization and sort of movement, rational model? Because if you're making this allusion between body and mind, the mind that we're talking about is a homogeneous, standardized mind, I would say. There's a really good book by the next billion users of the internet that talks about diversification of digital technologies, one of those versus the big five of internet, and how might we overcome this and provide more, you could say, epistemic cultures in this way.
Thanks. That's indeed a very important question. I don't have the answer to it. I'm aware of the importance of that question. Right? Digitalization can take us both. It can take us in either direction. Right? We've seen the first, I guess, digital totalitarianism in China, right? Which really homogenizes semiotic systems. And we're fighting with this contradiction. On the one hand, digitalization made Cambridge Analytica possible, right? We're talking about algorithms of hate and so on, which certainly actually homogenize the mind, as you say. On the other hand, the internet has produced unprecedented pluralism too. I think it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be ideological. I don't have the answer to the question. I think it's the question to tackle. Thank you very much. I hope I'm managing to touch upon what you're looking at. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alin.